Hello and welcome. He's an American icon with a very colourful history who holds back no punches when he strikes at the political system with his tough commentary. But his place in history comes just as much from his best-selling books and plays. This week on 101, meet American author, screenwriter and political commentator Gore Vidal.
The word unique barely describes a man as remarkable as Gore Vidal. He was born in West Point, New York, and named Eugene Luther after his father, an accomplished Olympic athlete and aviator who enjoyed taking his son out for weekend flights. Vidal Sr. was also the lover of the ill-fated pilot and explorer Amelia Earhart. He and Vidal's mother divorced while their son was still young, leaving the boy largely in the care of his maternal grandfather, the blind Senator T.P. Gore in Washington, D.C., exposing him to some real American politicking. By the time Vidal entered the U.S. Army after graduating, he was already writing regularly, and by his early 20s published The City and the Pillar, causing a stir, being one of the first books in America to unambiguously refer to homosexuality, which, says Vidal, makes it one of his most important pieces of work. His professional life then flourished, bringing Vidal close to movie stars and top political players, including President John F. Kennedy, the husband of his stepsister Jacqueline. Over time, the prolific writer embraced the role of a no-holds-barred, tough political commentator, penning books questioning America's leaders, particularly in going to war in Iraq and Afghanistan. Even though ill health challenges him in his later years, there are still very few who would risk taking on the sharp tongue and deadly wit of Gore Vidal.
Gore Vidal, it's great to have some time with you. Thank you, I'm honoured.
Well, good to see you again.
Thank you, sir. You're considered one of the sort of, I guess, last remaining legends of the American literary scene, in the sense that a lot of the big names now have passed away, and there's no one really taking on the mantle of that kind of work and that kind of, that standard of writing. Why do you think that is?
Because nobody took on the great mantle of reader. Americans don't read. Nobody taught them how. They're not going to learn how. And they're the greatest nation in the world, you know that. Everybody says so. That's why they keep shooting us all the time. Every time we turn around, there's a gun going off. Well, it's jealousy.
This
is irony, by the way, let me tell you out there.
The interesting thing is that you've spent, you know, a lot of your life being very, very vocally critical against the politics of America and the aggressive foreign policy, particularly by the US, which seems to have taken the direction opposite to the one you advocate. I mean, how do you regard the way American policy has gone nowadays in its sort of expansionist attitude?
Well, insanity. You don't go to war against most of the world unless you can win one of the wars. We don't count World War II. We had a little help from the Russians. Russians complained we didn't say much about them. There we were. And it was a periodic war which our great industries need, so they tell us, for weapons. General Electric owns one of the great networks. Will that great network ever criticize General Electric for making the atomic bomb and encouraging its usage in Japan? No, they won't. We overlap too many things, except intelligence, which we don't have that much else to overlap, so it's off in the corner.
Well, you've certainly remained an outspoken critic, but I wonder if, watching the way the world has shaped up in the past few decades, whether you really feel that the words you offer fall on deaf ears.
I don't care. They will be dead ears before I am deaf. So bye-bye.
Well, I'm going to take you back to your place of birth, West Point in New York. And at that time you were growing up, I mean, pretty much just in time to witness, as a young boy, the Great Depression. And I wonder what you remember of what you saw in those early years.
Well, I saw veterans of World War I selling apples or giving them away and hoping somebody would give them 10 cents to go away. I was duly shocked, and I lived with my grandfather, the senator from Oklahoma, who was the last of the great populist leaders of the 19th century. He and William Jennings Bryan and La Follette. We actually had liberal politicians. we know that they're all commies, really, and I just laughed up at my sleeve when I saw people, cottoning to them. We have become one of the most dismal countries on earth. And I didn't think this was... I got out of the Army in 1946. I'd been in from 43 to 46. And I had lost the use of a leg, and I thought, well, Army sweetly offered to give me a peg leg or something. I said, no, I'll get along with what I have. And then I realized, I ended up in a lot of veterans' places, and I'd see all my mates around me who had lost much worse than just a superfluous leg. I was never going to run the mile, in any case.
Well, you had an incredibly colourful family, and the family history was remarkable. Your father, Gene, was an aeronautical engineer, but he actually was an Olympic athlete.
Yes.
And helped co-found 3 airlines. He was the great love... Was it 5 of them? Wow. Well, and the great love of Amelia Earhart, or is that the case? That was actually the case?
Would you like to see their picture? They're side by side here.
Wonderful.
There's Amelia, and she was in love with him. He was very fond of her, but he says it was like having a kid brother, which was not his idea of joy, but anyway. Oh no, she was always around in our lives, and 1936, we all said goodbye to her. She came out here to do her takeoff for the flight across the Pacific. And my father warned her she had taken an alcoholic aboard as a navigator. And she asked him, would he come? He said, look, I'm director of air commerce. I cannot go off with a mere flyer and pretend that I'm doing my job. And so he didn't go, thank God. She didn't come back. It was very sad for America. She was one of the few ennobling figures that we had. In fact, there were 2 of them, and they knew each other. One was Eleanor Roosevelt, wife to the president, and the other was Amelia, married to a man she loathed called George Palmer Putnam, a publisher, to be avoided.
Well, your mother, Nina, was an actress and a socialite, and...
No, she was not an actress.
She was not?
She appeared in the old days, I'm speaking now of the 1920s, whenever a company came to any big city, but particularly Washington, immediately the producers would go to the daughter of the most famous man, realizing at least Congress would give them a good vote. So they went to the daughter of Senator Gore, who was president pro tem, I think, at that time of the Senate. And so she had a job as an extra. Well, she lived off that for 1,000 years, from the days when she was a great actress. She had vanity and no sense, and the 2 are not agreeable together.
What was the stories about her and Clark Gable? Were they true?
Well, she ended her years with him, living together in a bungalow at the Beverly Hills Hotel.
Now, that rocky marriage that your parents had, of course, ended when you were still a boy, and you spent most of your years in D.C., your childhood years, with your grandfather, T.P. Gore. Right. And were you, at that age, were you aware of this sort of the way the family was shaping up?
Of course I was. Nor did I give a damn. You must remember the ruling class of this country believes in divorce passionately. It would be unnatural for my parents not to be divorced. And when they were, I was so thrilled. At least I was rid of her, and I liked him. So it ended with my father and me and my mother in Clark Gable. Who was happiest, do you think?
Your grandfather, T.P. Gore, Senator Gore, was blind, and you actually would read to him. You were his guide as well. I gather his political philosophy was what really rubbed off on you a lot in those early years.
Oh, yeah, and very right-wing he was. You see, that is now an ugly term. A right-wing means you believe in the flat earth and all sorts of silly things. Well, it wasn't in that time. It means you believed in the American Constitution. I was one of the few voices that went on television and yelled when Bush, with that ghastly little attorney general, got rid of the Bill of Rights in our country. So he and Bush together, Bush wanted more power. More power you get by being a wartime president. You do that by declaring war on somebody without asking them. That's what he did. That's what Bush did. In a normal country, both Bush and he would have been imprisoned and tried for treason.
Growing up, because of this situation with your mother, your father, the sentiments you've expressed, was there a real sense of a lack of family cohesion? Did you really feel you grew up without a family?
Oh, I prayed that I would be a man without a family. And in due course, everybody did die, so I got out of it. No. The only one well, my grandfather looked after me. My grandmother was a foster mother. And my father was well, we went flying every weekend. Some advantage to being director of air commerce, which is what he was under President Roosevelt.
Well, you're named after your father, Eugene Luther Vidal, and the Gore came from your mother's family name, from the maiden name. When did you shorten it to Gore Vidal?
When I was at Exeter, the school I went to in New England, I was already publishing poetry at 19, 20. Eugene Luther Vidal is a little bit too heavy and too ponderous. And I also don't like Junior, for God's sake.
But you had an interesting mix of people in your family too. You're a distant cousin of Al Gore, and Jimmy Carter, I gather, as well. And ended up as a stepbrother to Jacqueline Kennedy too, who I gather was very close to you and treated you as a confidant.
Well, she was sly and she didn't treat anybody as a confidant, but I teased her, and I became one.
Do you keep much in terms of your contact with those distant relatives? Was that something significant to you or important to you?
No. Well, when Jack was president, obviously, you make yourself. I got the most votes of any Democrat in northern New York the same month that he got elected president. So I was offered posts in the government.
Well, in 1943, when you graduated from the Phillips Exeter Academy, so you went into the U.S. Army, and I wonder that was the time you were already writing, and you published some of those experiences in your first book,
Oh, really?
The Holy War, and I wonder what you felt you learned from being in the Army. What lessons did that time there teach you?
Well, it was no worse than school. It wasn't as interesting as school, certainly. You remember, I was brought up with generals. My mother married two. And my father held the rank of Major General in the Air Force, being one of the founders of the Air Force. Although he didn't serve, he just was awarded the rank, which he used to get himself to 3 wars, which otherwise he'd be too old to go to. And he was furious that his kid brother was a brigadier general in the Air Force, and that several more members of the family were also Army flyers. I had a stepbrother who was the most famous ace in World War II airplanes. Robin Olds. He was an All-American football player, as was my father. He's a marvelous flyer. Later commandant of the Air Force Academy.
Did you take any pride in the fact your father had achieved so much in athletics too? I mean, to get to the Olympics is quite a feat.
Well, if you're not interested in athletics, I mean, he might have been a chess champion for all I cared.
Did you have a sense that in those early years when you had started writing the poetry and actually were taking to writing, that it would be a career for you, that it was something you wanted to do in your later adult life?
Well, it was something I had to do. I mean, you don't set out to be a poet. Well, maybe some people set out to be poets, but I just wrote poetry. And then in due time, somebody said, well, why don't you publish this, or why don't you do that, and so on. That's how it works.
You seem to find a regular place on the bestseller lists fairly soon once you started writing. And this was in spite of the fact that you know, in your early books, in fact, in one of your earliest books, The City and the Pillar, you created quite an outrage by openly talking about homosexuality.
Well, the United States had created an outrage in me. And I think I'm more important in the long run than that country, which has not been heard from recently, except for blowing up villages in the desert.
Well, in those days, of course, we're talking at a time, 1948, when the sensibilities were very different in America. And the New York Times actually refused to review your next 5 books, I gather. And I was wondering,
Six.
was it 6? Now, I'm wondering what kind of backlash you had in general for being so open about what was really a taboo subject.
Well, there's a man called Orville Prescott, who was the daily reviewer for the New York Times, and he chose the books that would be reviewed. When The City and the Pillar came out, he objected to the subject and so forth. And he had liked my first book, which was a war novel. But he made a lot of fuss about it, and, well, it got rather ugly. My publisher went to him and said, "What do you think you're doing? You are the newspaper of record, and Mr. Vidal is part of the record, admitted by foreign countries," and so forth and so on. He was absolutely stupid, but you know, that's not unusual in American journalism. If everybody else is stupid, they might just well be dumb too. So that's what we're up against. Indomitable stupidity.
Well, you eventually admitted that JT, to whom you had dedicated that book, was Jimmy Trimble, who was one of your close friends, a late friend who died at Iwo Jima in World War II. You said at one time this is the person you'd loved most in your life. I mean, and I'm wondering if that, when you make a statement like that, whether it's something you ever get over.
One, I never made it. That's most statements that are ascribed to anyone are generally tarted up by others. No, and they said, we're talking about the people lost at Iwo Jima, and had I gone into the Marines, I would have been there at the same time. I don't say I envied him for being there, because he was killed on the first night of the landing by bad intelligence of the U.S. Navy. We had, along with every other, mendacity, we had the world's worst intelligence all through the war. No matter what you served in, it was always going to get it wrong. Nobody had noticed that the Japanese were already on the island of Iwo Jima. Underground, they hid down there. Wasn't that awful? I mean, an American would have come forth with a red, white, and blue flag. But these things happen when you have foreigners in a war. So I think we always tried not to fight them because we generally lost.
In 1960, you ran for Congress, and you were backed by some fairly prominent people, celebrity supporters such as Eleanor Roosevelt, Paul Newman, Joan Woodward, who was actually ex-fiancée of yours and who ended up marrying Paul Newman eventually. Now, you received some popular support and a high number of votes, but of course it was, in the long run, unsuccessful for you. You didn't have much luck in that bid for office. It didn't stop you going again for governor of California in 1982, and I wonder what you thought you would achieve if you were in politics.
Well, remember, he went against me. I didn't go against Jerry Brown, governor of the state. The last thing I would want to be for $1 trillion, I wouldn't take governorship of California. It's a can of worms.
Did you think that going into politics at the time, initially in 1960 with Congress and then obviously that later stint or the later effort, that you could do something different from the inside?
Of course I could.
You wouldn't have to compromise too much as a politician?
Well, I was also better known than anyone in the Congress, which I never ceased to remind them.
Have you enjoyed your sort of battles with the political world over the years?
Not much. If I'd been more victorious, I might say I delighted in them, but I was never really on the winning side because you work that one out, and that's what you are.
Did you ever expect, though, in your lifetime to witness the election of a black president?
No, but I was delighted. Washington's a black town. I was brought up in it. Everybody I knew was black.
Well, you actually spent quite a bit of your time outside America, and you were in Italy for quite a while. And I wonder how you adjusted to the idea of coming back in 2003 and spending most of your time here, full-time, I guess.
Well, not full-time, no. Well, let's say I preferred living in Italy to living in the United States of America. And if anyone doesn't like that, I'll tell you also what I think of you, too.
Now, you of course have a huge body of work, from your novels to your plays and the scripts and so on. And I wonder, when you look back, we could of course discuss those for hours. But when you look back, what do you consider the really important work that you've done?
Well, City in the Pillar. That opened up a vista that nobody had gazed upon before. And, well, I made things happen that had not happened before. I believe that is the point of literature, or being alive, or something, or other.
You even tried a stint at acting. How did that suit you?
I still do it.
Well, that's right. I mean, appearances and so on. But that time when you were doing a little more.
Well, I did a little lot.
Quite a bit, yeah. I mean, did it appeal to you, that world of Hollywood?
I didn't go in it to get into a world of Hollywood. I was already in that, writing movies. So there it was.
Even some of your harshest critics, will admit to the quality of your work. And Martin Amis, for example, once said, even his blind spots are illuminating. Now, I wonder, of course, when you put yourself out there with work, how you personally handle the criticism. Is it something you take very personally?
Of course not. You are not in public life if that bothers you. And I've never not been in public life.
Do you think, though, in the long run, of course, you've had, by a lot of people's standards, a very alternative lifestyle. You had relationships with men and women, and, of course, in later years, you were with one partner, with one male partner. And I wonder if America was ready as a society for accepting that kind of...
You act as though America was a fact. It's a notion. It's a flag. It's a lot of loud noise. I don't think much of anybody takes it very seriously.
I'm going to ask you that question again, sir, because we had the phone ringing there. So
that was America calling.
Yeah, was it complaining?
Yes, saying if you say what you said last time, we're going to get you up for treason.
In November 2003, you lost your long-term partner, Howard Austin, to cancer. And it was a relationship you had for over half a century. You're known to be quite, sometimes abrasive and, of course, have a very, very direct punch. And I wonder what it was about the quality of your relationship together that made it last so long.
Well, if you analyze these things, they never come to pass, do they?
Just go by feel in this case.
No, of course.
If there's a message you would like people to take away from your work, what would it be?
Go away.
You have obviously in mind that, that there's some potential to change things with the work you do.
Of course there is.
So then, just looking at your relationship with various political figures, there's almost an irony in that you give them some pretty sharp jabs, and yet you had such a close relationship with so many of them, such as the Kennedys and such as some of the key figures.
That's the way it works,
Did you feel accepted by them in that way, as part of the community?
Look, I accept. They don't accept anybody. I am the one who decides, because I write the record. So that's how it goes. But it never occurred to me that I was on probation. I said the whole goddamn country's on probation when I am sitting here on the bench.
Do you have any regrets when you look at it, if you could turn the clock back, are there things you would change?
Oh, my nationality, certainly.
Beyond your nationality, perhaps?
There's nothing beyond that. We're stuck with that.
I know you have plans for this army in Canada to come and invade and change things, of course. But no, beyond that, is there anything, when you look at the way you shaped your life, is there anything that really, if you could change it, you would?
I'm a self-starter. You don't change them. Otherwise, they wouldn't be self-starters, would they?
So do you set yourself any goals or targets for the near future?
No. Why greet disappointment?
You have, of course, a great body of work out there, which will live on. But in terms of legacy, how you'd like to be remembered, what would it be?
Well, I came up with a good one the other day on some TV program. A lady was interviewing me, and what are you most proud of, Mr. Vidal? Despite provocation, I have never killed anyone. I thought that was pretty neat.
As a legacy.
Well, why not? There are worse legacies around.
I thank you very much for your time, sir. It was a real pleasure speaking with you.
Brother Khan?